Good evening, friends, and welcome back to Lunar History. Tonight, we set sail on a journey that has fascinated philosophers, explorers, and dreamers for more than 2,000 years. The mystery of Atlantis. Was it a shining empire swallowed by the sea, or a parable crafted to warn humanity about pride and corruption? That question alone has kept the legend alive, sparking countless theories, books, films, and even expeditions across the globe. Before we dive deep into this ancient riddle, let me ask you for a quick favor. If you enjoy stories that combine history, myth, and timeless lessons, please take a moment to hit the like button. Subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell. It may seem like a small gesture, but it helps us continue creating these long-form explorations for you, and it ensures you'll never miss a journey like this one again. Now, let's set the scene. Imagine an island beyond the Pillars of Hercules, in the great Atlantic Ocean, where the air smelled of cedar and salt, and where fertile fields stretched as far as the eye could see. This was no ordinary land. According to Plato, the philosopher who first told the tale, Atlantis was blessed with natural resources, divine favor, and unmatched beauty. Its walls shimmered with metals that no modern hand has ever recovered. Its harbors welcomed fleets of ships, and its people lived with both abundance and discipline. But legends rarely remain golden forever. The same wealth and power that lifted Atlantis to greatness also planted the seeds of its downfall. Some versions of the story describe how the Atlanteans became arrogant, greedy, and careless with the blessings they had been given. Others suggest that their leaders turned to excess, celebrating luxury over responsibility. And in the end, whether by divine judgment, shifting earth, or the violent waves of the sea, the once proud empire crumbled and vanished beneath the waters. Yet here is where the tale becomes more than just a bedtime story. For centuries, Atlantis has been a mirror held up to humanity itself. When we hear of its rise and fall, we are asked to reflect. How do great civilizations endure, and why do they sometimes collapse? These are not questions limited to the past. They remain deeply relevant today. In this video, we're not just going to retell the legend word for word. Instead, we'll explore where the story came from, what ancient writers actually said, and how each generation has reimagined the lost city. We'll compare the myth to real historical events, like the fall of Troy or the destruction of Hellike in Greece. And we'll ask whether the legend of Atlantis was ever meant to be taken literally at all, or if its true purpose was to serve as a warning for future societies. So, find a comfortable place to relax, let your mind drift with the tide of history, and allow this story to carry you across oceans of time. By the end, you may not only understand the legend of Atlantis more deeply, but also discover the timeless lesson hidden in its waves. Let us begin not with certainty, but with a question that has echoed across centuries. When we hear the name Atlantis, are we listening to the faint memory of a real civilization swallowed by the sea? Or are we entering a carefully woven parable, created by one of history's greatest thinkers, to reflect on human weakness and ambition? The mystery endures, not because we have answers carved in stone, but because every retelling offers us a different mirror in which to see ourselves. And every generation has found in the legend a story that feels both impossibly distant and strangely familiar. It is this tension, this constant pull between the dream of discovery and the possibility of allegory, that has kept Atlantis alive in our collective imagination long after so many other myths have faded. Plato, the philosopher who first spoke of Atlantis, never described it as a fairy tale to amuse children or a fable to pass idle time. He framed it within his dialogues as if it were history passed down through generations. A tale of a land beyond the known world, rich in resources, disciplined in order, and radiant with divine favor, yet destined to collapse when its people abandoned moderation for excess. Whether he intended to give us an account of a lost chapter in human history, or a symbolic story to teach future societies, remains uncertain. But what is undeniable is how powerfully the idea has gripped minds across continents and centuries. Scholars, adventurers, and ordinary dreamers alike have looked at maps of the seas and wondered if beneath the waves Somewhere lie the ruins of the shining city he described. What makes the story so captivating is not merely the promise of sunken marble temples or glittering metals unknown to us, but the haunting lesson that resonates beneath the imagery. A society that had everything: fertile land, advanced engineering, thriving culture, and even divine blessing could not withstand the corrupting pull of pride and greed. To some, Atlantis is a literal warning etched into history by disaster. Proof that civilizations can rise to unimaginable heights and fall just as quickly when they forget the values that sustained them. To others, it is a symbolic narrative, one that Plato used to hold up a mirror to Athens, and perhaps to all future nations, reminding us that power without restraint and wealth without wisdom inevitably lead to collapse. As we drift deeper into this exploration, it becomes clear that the truth of Atlantis may never be confirmed by archaeology or geology, and yet its meaning has outlived any need for physical evidence. The legend endures not because we can point to a location on a map, but because it taps into a universal pattern of human history: the rise of civilizations through discipline and ingenuity, and their eventual downfall when arrogance replaces humility. This is why every mention of Atlantis still stirs the imagination, why countless books and documentaries return to its story, and why, even now, we gather here to listen, to wonder, and to reflect. When we trace the origins of this tale, we find ourselves not in the ruins of a sunken city or in the logbooks of explorers, but in the quiet and deliberate words of Plato, the philosopher whose writings have shaped so much of how the Western world thinks about truth, morality, and the fragile order of human society. For it is within two of his dialogues, Timaeus and Creatus, that the story of Atlantis first emerges, not as a casual aside, but as part of a larger discussion about the ideal state, the nature of the cosmos, and the forces that govern human destiny. And it is here that we discover not only the description of a lost island empire, but also the philosophical weight that would make the story endure for more than 2 millennia. In these dialogues, Plato has his characters recount a tale supposedly passed down through generations, originating with Solon, the great Athenian lawmaker, who, during his travels in Egypt, was told by priests of a powerful land that had once existed far beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which we now know as the Strait of Gibraltar, a land greater than Libya and Asia combined, an empire so vast and organized that it extended its power deep into the Mediterranean until it met its match in the proud and defiant city of Athens. The Egyptians, according to this account, preserved in their sacred writings the memory of this confrontation, and Plato has his characters weave it into a narrative that places Athens at the center of a heroic struggle against overwhelming odds. A struggle that, unlike many myths of conquest, ends not in the victory of the larger, wealthier power, but in the resilience of a smaller state defending its freedom. What makes Plato's telling remarkable is the way he paints Atlantis in vivid detail, not as an abstract symbol, but as a living world with canals, temples, palaces, and vast armies, a place where Poseidon himself, god of the sea, had once walked, blessing the land with abundance, and where human rulers governed through laws inscribed on pillars of orichalcum, a metal that gleamed with a brilliance no longer seen. Atlantis, in Plato's description, was not simply a name on a map. It was a place of stone and water, of rituals and courts, of markets and worships, described with the precision of someone intent on making his audience believe in its reality, even while the moral lessons it carried remained clear. And yet beneath this vivid imagery lies a deeper question. Did Plato intend for his readers to search for Atlantis as archaeologists search for Troy? Or did he wish instead to use the story as a cautionary parable, a way to reflect on the dangers of hubris and the fragility of power? This question has divided scholars for centuries, some insisting that the details are too precise to be pure invention, others arguing that Plato, a master of allegory, created Atlantis as a mirror to challenge Athens itself, warning his contemporaries that even the greatest civilizations can collapse when they abandon balance for ambition. Whatever the answer, what cannot be denied is that Plato's dialogues gave birth to one of the most enduring mysteries in human imagination, a mystery that continues to ripple across history, drawing explorers to distant shores and dreamers to the depths of their own wonder. In the unfolding of Plato's tale, the grandeur of Atlantis does not simply begin with walls of stone or fleets of ships, but with a myth that reaches back into the realm of gods and mortals. For the origins of this fabled empire are bound to Poseidon, the mighty ruler of the seas, whose power stirred both the waves of the ocean and the hearts of humankind. It is said that upon a sacred hill, far from the noise of crowded cities and touched by a stillness that seemed to hold within it the breath of eternity, there lived a mortal woman named Plato, a figure shrouded in quiet beauty and solitude, and it was here, amid springs of fresh water and fertile earth, that Poseidon encountered her, drawn by a force that even a god could not resist. Their union, born not merely of passion, but of a divine claim upon the land itself, would lay the foundation of the royal bloodline of Atlantis, forever linking the island to both mortal endeavor and divine favor. To protect her, and perhaps to mark the land as his own, Poseidon is said to have encircled the hill with alternating rings of sea and land, great concentric barriers that no ordinary man could cross without design or purpose. And in doing so, he created the very layout that would later define the capital of Atlantis, a place where engineering and myth became indistinguishable. Within this sanctified space, Plato bore Poseidon 10 sons, each destined to govern a portion of the island. And together they formed a dynasty that blended human ambition with divine heritage rulers, whose authority was sanctified by the blood of a god. Among them, the eldest son, Atlas, gave his name not only to the island itself, but in time, to the ocean that stretched beyond it. A reminder of how deeply the myth sought to intertwine the fate of this people with the very geography of the world. From this beginning, the Atlanteans would see themselves not as ordinary men and women bound by the limits of mortality, but as heirs to a sacred covenant, children of a lineage that carried both responsibility and privilege. The rings of water and land, said to have been carved by Poseidon's own hand, were more than defenses. They were symbols of separation and protection, marking Atlantis as a chosen place, unique in its origin, set apart from all other lands. It was here that temples rose in honor of Poseidon, glimmering with precious metals and adorned with statues of horses and sea deities, testifying to the belief that their prosperity was rooted in divine grace. And it was here, too, that laws were written and judgments passed, echoing with the authority of both God and man. This mythical beginning did more than give Atlantis a founding story. It gave it a destiny, for in the eyes of its people, they were not merely builders of canals or keepers of fertile fields, but the guardians of a legacy bestowed by the Lord of the Seas himself. And yet, as with all tales, where divine favor elevates mortals beyond their natural station, the question lingers: could such a people ever remain humble? Or would the memory of their origins feed a sense of pride so great that it would eventually lead them toward ruin? From the union of Poseidon and Plato, the land itself seemed to awaken with a richness that set Atlantis apart from every other corner of the known world. For it was not only the divine bloodline that gave the island its power, but also the extraordinary fertility of its soil and the abundance of its natural resources, which together created a landscape that seemed almost designed to nourish greatness. Across the broad plains, fields of wheat and barley swayed like a golden sea beneath the wind, promising harvests that would feed armies, families and festivals alike, while terraces heavy with grapes gave birth to wines that sparkled in the light of dawn and perfumed the air with their sweetness. Between the orchards, fig trees bent beneath the weight of their fruit, while groves of olives, ancient and enduring, offered not only nourishment, but also oil for lamps, for cooking, and for sacred rites, reminding the people that every harvest was both sustenance and symbol. Nor was Atlantis only a land of cultivated abundance. It was also a kingdom of forests so vast and deep that they seemed endless. There, towering trees rising like pillars into the sky, providing timber for ships, beams for palaces, and fuel for forges. In these woods lived animals in great variety, offering meat, hides, and labor. and so complete was the balance between man and nature that every need of the people was met by what the land provided. Springs of clear water flowed from the hillsides, some cool and fresh, others warm and steaming, as if heated from the heart of the earth itself. And from these springs ran rivers that cut through fertile valleys, feeding both crops and people with a generosity that appeared inexhaustible. The island's richness extended even to the ground beneath their feet, where the soil yielded metals in dazzling variety: copper, tin, silver, and gold, all drawn from the earth with skill and transformed into tools, ornaments, and the coinage of commerce. Even the legendary orichalcum, a metal said to gleam with a fiery glow, unlike any substance known today, was found in Atlantis. And with it they decorated their temples, their walls, and their sacred altars, creating a city that glittered as if it had captured fragments of the sun itself. When the Atlanteans looked upon their land, they saw not only sustenance, but also wealth, power, and divine favor, a combination so rare and so perfect that it seemed impossible such abundance could ever fade. And yet, in this abundance lay a quiet temptation. For a people who are constantly blessed by fertile fields and overflowing resources may come to believe that fortune will always favor them, that their prosperity is eternal, and that they are destined never to know want or hardship. Thus, while the fertile land of Atlantis became the foundation of its greatness, it also whispered a dangerous promise, that they need only take what was given, without restraint, and that the bounty of nature was theirs forever. This belief would feed their pride, and in time, their pride would test the very balance upon which their world was built. Long before the palaces gleamed with precious metals, and before the harbors filled with fleets of ships, the people of Atlantis shaped their lives according to a quieter rhythm, one that honored the patience of the seasons, the order of community, and the delicate balance between land and sea that sustained them. They understood, perhaps more clearly than later generations would, that abundance was not an invitation to waste, nor a license to indulge without restraint, but rather a responsibility to live in harmony with the forces that granted such plenty. And so they cultivated habits of discipline, moderation, and reverence, seeing in every harvest not merely food for survival, but a reminder of their covenant with the earth and with the gods who had given them this extraordinary home. Families worked side by side in the fields, planting when the time was right, and waiting without haste for the moment of ripening, and in their patience they found not only sustenance, but also strength, for they knew that order in daily life created resilience in times of uncertainty. In their villages and towns there was little of the chaos or indulgence that would later mark their decline, for the early Atlanteans built their society on a foundation of mutual responsibility, where each person, role, whether farmer, craftsman, sailor, or priest, was seen as part of a greater design. The fisherman who cast his nets into the glittering waters at dawn was no less vital than the mason who shaped stone for bridges and walls, and together they sustained a balance that mirrored the natural harmony around them. They saw the sea not as an enemy to be conquered, nor the land as a resource to be exhausted, but rather as partners in a living cycle, one offering its fish and its trade routes, the other its crops and its forests. And it was this respect for balance that allowed their communities to flourish without devouring the very sources of their prosperity. Rituals and traditions reinforced these values, for in their temples they offered thanks not only for victories or wealth, but for the steady return of the tides, the quiet rising of the sun over their fields, and the dependable rhythm of planting and reaping that tied them to the eternal order of the cosmos. Children learned patience from their elders, who taught them that true strength came not from haste or greed, but from endurance and wisdom, and that to take more than the earth or sea willingly offered was to invite imbalance, a lesson that seemed to echo through every aspect of their lives. In this early age, Atlantis was less a kingdom of conquest and more a community of harmony, a place where prosperity was guided by restraint, where ambition was tempered by respect for natural order, and where people believed that the greatest wealth was found not in excess, but in balance. Yet, as history and myth so often remind us, such harmony is fragile, easily disturbed by the creeping desire for more. And though the Atlanteans of this age lived with wisdom and patience, the seeds of change, imperceptible at first, were already stirring beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when abundance and divine favor would no longer be enough to satisfy their growing ambition. As the society of Atlantis matured, and its people began to look beyond the rhythms of planting and harvesting that had sustained their earliest generations, they turned their attention to shaping the very landscape around them. Not content merely to live upon the earth, but determined to guide its waters, enrich its soil, and bend its bounty toward even greater abundance. And it was in this pursuit that the Atlanteans revealed both their ingenuity and their discipline, for they became masters of engineering and agriculture on a scale that astonished even those who later tried to retell their story. With a vision that united practicality and grandeur, they cut vast canals through the plains, channels of water that not only connected the heart of the island to its harbors, but also carried life into fields that would otherwise have remained dry, ensuring that no corner of their fertile land went to waste. And through these waterways they created a network that was as much about irrigation as it was about transport. A living system where crops flourished, boats passed with ease, and the land itself seemed to pulse with vitality. The farmers of Atlantis, guided by traditions that stretched back to their earliest ancestors, but enhanced by innovations born of observation and experimentation, devised methods of planting and crop rotation that allowed their fields to yield harvest after harvest without exhaustion, balancing grains like wheat and barley with orchards of fruit trees and the hardy olive groves that provided both sustenance and trade. They understood the cycles of the soil, how to replenish what had been taken, how to channel water so that each field drank in just enough without flooding, and how to harness the strength of animals, not merely for labor, but for the renewal of the land itself. This marriage of knowledge and discipline allowed them to cultivate vast stretches of farmland capable of supporting not only their growing population, but also the soldiers, priests, and artisans who depended on the steady provision of food, for no empire, however grand its walls or ships, could rise without a foundation rooted in the earth's abundance. The canals themselves became symbols of both practicality and pride, lined with embankments, bridges, and sluices that demonstrated the precision of their builders, while reservoirs collected fresh water for the dry months, ensuring that famine remained a distant threat. Around the capital, the concentric rings of land and water, carved as legend claimed by Poseidon himself, were expanded and refined by human hands with causeways, allowing movement between districts and the surrounding fields nourished by carefully managed streams that carried the lifeblood of agriculture. Even the hillsides were terraced to prevent erosion and to maximize cultivation, each level a testament to the Atlanteans' determination to shape their world with order and foresight. To the Atlanteans, these achievements were not merely technical feats, but living proof of their harmony with the forces of nature, for by guiding water, they did not seek to defy it, but to partner with it, creating a balance between human will and natural flow. Their canals glittered in the sunlight, their fields rippled with healthy crops, and their storehouses brimmed with grain and fruit. All of it speaking to a society that had mastered the delicate art of transforming abundance into stability. Yet, as the years passed and prosperity grew, the very success of these systems fed a sense of invulnerability, a belief that their ingenuity could solve every problem and that no limit stood before them. A belief that, while inspiring, also carried within it the first shadows of pride that would one day overreach the wisdom that had once guided their hands. As the canals spread across the plains and the fields yielded harvests in abundance, the Atlanteans turned their skill and vision toward the very heart of their civilization, building not only systems of survival, but monuments that reflected their power, their wealth, and their sense of divine destiny. And nowhere was this more evident than in the architecture of their capital, a city encircled by 3 great walls that rose in concentric rings, each one more splendid than the last, crafted from stones whose colors were drawn directly from the island's own mountains. The builders quarried blocks of gleaming white that shone in the sun like marble, deep red stone that burned with the glow of fire, and rich black stone that carried the weight of earth and shadow, and by placing them side by side, they created a vision of contrast and harmony that made the walls appear almost alive, as if the land itself had offered its palate to the hands of men. Within these walls, metal was not merely used, but celebrated, for Atlantis was blessed with veins of bronze and tin that fed their forges, producing tools, weapons, and ornaments that spread across the city, while silver and gold adorned their palaces and temples with a brilliance that seemed to capture both moonlight and sunlight. Most dazzling of all, however, was the legendary orichalcum, a metal described by Plato as second only to gold in value and beauty, a substance that gleamed with a fiery radiance unlike anything known today. With it the Atlanteans sheathed the walls of their temples, inlaid the floors of their sanctuaries, and engraved inscriptions upon massive pillars, so that whenever the light touched their city, it shimmered as though it had been kissed by the very flame of the gods. The temples of Poseidon, in particular, glowed with orichalcum, its altars glittering, its walls radiant, a constant reminder to the people of their divine patron and the blessings that had shaped their destiny. The concentric design of the city itself revealed both practicality and grandeur, for each ring of walls enclosed a district, and between them ran wide channels of water, bridged by causeways, creating an intricate pattern of land and sea that not only provided defense, but also reflected the mythic origins of the city, when Poseidon himself encircled Cleitos Hill with alternating rings to protect her. In the outermost districts stood warehouses, shipyards, and markets where trade flourished. In the middle rings, homes, workshops, and smaller temples filled the streets, and in the innermost sanctum, rising high above all else, stood the royal palace and the great temple of Poseidon, their surfaces gleaming with precious metals and polished stone, commanding the gaze of all who entered the city. Everywhere one looked, the architecture of Atlantis carried a sense of both human mastery and divine blessing, as though each stone and each column testified to the union of mortal hands and immortal favor. Bridges arched gracefully across the waterways. Docks stretched into harbors filled with vessels of polished timber, and broad avenues lined with statues told the stories of gods, kings, and heroes, ensuring that memory was etched not only in words, but in the very fabric of the city. The people walked these streets with pride, for their city was not only functional, but also beautiful, an earthly paradise that seemed destined to last forever. And yet, as in all great stories, the brilliance of their materials and the strength of their walls could not guard against the subtler weaknesses of the heart, for even the most radiant orichalcum could not protect a people from the dangers of excess arrogance and neglect of the very balance that had once made them strong. From the shimmering walls and radiant temples, one's gaze would naturally be drawn outward to the very arteries of the city itself, for the brilliance of Atlantis was not confined to its monuments, but extended to the intricate design that bound its people, its markets, and its harbors into a single living organism. The engineers of Atlantis, guided by a vision of order that mirrored both the concentric rings of their mythic origins and the natural rhythm of sea and land, carved waterways and avenues with such precision that the city seemed less like a cluster of districts and more like a grand symphony of movement, each part in harmony with the others. Bridges of stone, their arches faced with polished metals, stretched across the canals that separated one ring from the next, allowing goods, people, and even ceremonial processions to flow effortlessly between districts. And each span was not merely practical, but designed with artistry, so that a walk across the bridges became an experience of splendor in itself. Where the gleam of bronze railings caught the morning light and statues of gods or kings stood sentinel as reminders of both protection and pride. The harbors sheltered by the concentric walls and the natural embrace of the island's geography were marvels of both beauty and utility, their piers faced with dark stone that resisted the eternal bite of salt and spray, while broad quays welcomed fleets of trading vessels, whose sails carried the colors of lands near and far. Sailors spoke of the ease with which ships could glide into the Atlantean harbors, for the city's waterways had been carefully planned to tame the sea without denying its force, creating calm channels where cargo could be unloaded and markets replenished with goods from across the known world. The inner rings, too, were served by smaller docks and channels that ensured supplies could flow seamlessly to the heart of the city, so that even the most distant district was connected to the pulse of trade and the rhythm of daily life. The streets laid with care and aligned with purpose allowed grain, carts, processions, and citizens alike to move without chaos. For Atlantis was a city that breathed in patterns of order rather than confusion. Markets were placed where canals converged. Temples stood at the ends of broad avenues, where sightlines directed reverence toward the gods, and residential quarters clustered near the fertile lands that fed them. It was as though every stone, every bridge, every harbor pier had been set down according to a vision that combined divine inspiration with human discipline, creating a city whose very shape seemed to whisper of stability, permanence, and destiny. Travelers from distant lands, who entered Atlantis for the first time, often marveled not only at the sheer scale of its architecture or the wealth of its metals, but at the sense of structure that pervaded every corner. For here was a city where nothing seemed accidental, where the layout itself spoke of a people who understood that greatness was not achieved in bursts of brilliance, but through the steady, deliberate arrangement of life into a pattern that could endure. Yet, even as the bridges held firm and the harbors bustled with the lifeblood of commerce, the very order that gave Atlantis its strength also carried within it the seed of pride. For a city that begins to see its structure as unshakable may one day forget that even the most carefully laid plans remain vulnerable to forces far greater than stone, metal, or human design. Beneath the grand bridges and the bustling harbors hidden within the very veins of the city, flowed another marvel that set Atlantis apart from every other civilization of its age. For while the world beyond still struggled with crude wells and primitive channels, the Atlanteans had mastered the element of water with a sophistication that seemed to blend divine favor with human genius. From the sacred hills where springs bubbled forth in both steaming warmth and icy clarity, a vast network of channels, pipes, and stone conduits carried life itself into every corner of the city, ensuring that no household, no market, no temple, and no palace was ever deprived of the blessings of water. It was said that in the royal precincts, courtyards shimmered with fountains whose plumes danced high into the air, cooled by the mountain-fed streams that had been guided and tamed, while nearby, vast public baths welcomed citizens of every class, their pools fed by subterranean streams that rose hot from the earth, offering not just cleansing of the body, but renewal of the spirit. The Atlanteans did not merely divert water. They shaped it, directed it, and elevated it into a kind of living art, carving aqueducts that glistened like ribbons of stone across the land, and embedding within the city itself an invisible network of channels that allowed fresh water to rush into kitchens, workshops, and gardens with ease. Farmers used these systems to flood their fields at the perfect moment, ensuring harvests of abundance, while in the inner districts, tiled baths with flowing hot and cold streams became a daily comfort, a luxury that many distant travelers regarded as a wonder greater than gold or silver. Public fountains adorned the plazas, each one sculpted with figures of gods, sea creatures, or mythic kings, so that the simple act of drawing water for drinking or washing became an encounter with art, beauty, and culture, reminding every citizen that they were heirs to a legacy unlike any other. In this mastery over water, Atlantis seemed to bridge the divide between nature and civilization. For while the rivers and seas might rage untamed beyond the island, within the concentric walls, water obeyed the designs of its people, flowing not with randomness but with harmony, bending its power to human need without losing its elemental grandeur. To walk through the city was to hear not just the clamor of markets or the ringing of bronze, but the constant murmur of water as it coursed beneath. Pavements spilled gently from marble spouts and thundered in cascades at ceremonial pools where offerings were made. Travelers spoke of the way the air itself seemed fresher, cooler, more alive in Atlantis than in any other city, as though the very atmosphere had been cleansed and enriched by the endless circulation of pure springs that never ceased to flow. Yet in the same way that bridges and harbors symbolized the outward order of Atlantis, these water systems revealed the inward soul of the city, a society that sought not only to dominate nature, but to weave it seamlessly into the fabric of daily existence, making life itself more abundant, more comfortable, more enduring. It was this harmony with water, this transformation of necessity into art and ritual, that gave Atlantis its reputation as a place not merely of wealth and power, but of refinement and grace, a city where the elements of earth, fire, and water seemed to bow in deference to human will, creating a vision of perfection that would echo in memory long after its stones had crumbled into the depths. If the flowing waters of Atlantis gave life to its people, then the marketplaces were the very heartbeat of the island, where that life pulsed with energy, movement, and the constant exchange of goods, ideas, and ambitions. From the earliest light of dawn, when fishermen carried their shimmering catches from the harbors to be laid upon marble slabs, to the waning glow of evening lanterns flickering over stalls piled high with figs, olives, and grain, the markets of Atlantis were places where the abundance of the land and the bounty of the sea met in a spectacle of prosperity that few civilizations could rival. Vast warehouses, built of stone and wood, reinforced with bronze fittings, rose alongside the great plazas, their cavernous interiors filled with wheat, barley, and fruit enough not only to sustain the city in times of plenty, but to ensure resilience in seasons of hardship. Granaries, guarded by both law and ritual, stood as a silent promise that no citizen would be left without bread. And these reserves made Atlantis not merely secure, but enviable to those beyond its shores, who often depended on the whims of nature for survival. Yet it was not only the practical that gave the Atlantean marketplaces their reputation, for here, commerce was infused with reverence and artistry, and even the currency itself carried the mark of divine favor. Coins of silver and bronze, struck with the proud image of Poseidon, served not merely as tokens of exchange, but as reminders that every transaction, whether a handful of grain, a jar of oil, or a carved trinket from distant lands, was conducted under the watchful eye of the god who had blessed the island from its very beginning. To hold such a coin was to feel, in some small way, connected to the myth of origins, a tangible link between everyday life and the divine narrative that defined Atlantis. Merchants from across the seas recognized these coins, not only for their purity and weight, but for the prestige they carried, and so Atlantean currency traveled far beyond the island, a silent ambassador of its influence and renown. The plazas themselves were spectacles of sound and color, alive with the calls of traders announcing their wares, the clatter of amphorae being unsealed, and the scents of spices, resins, and fresh produce blending into an intoxicating perfume that seemed to embody the richness of the island itself. Artisans displayed pottery whose designs told stories of gods and kings. Jewelers laid out ornaments fashioned from orichalcum and precious stones, and foreign traders brought exotic goods, silks, ivory, and rare spices that spoke of journeys across distant seas. In this way, the markets were not only a place of survival or even wealth, but a stage where the interconnectedness of the world was laid bare, where Atlantis stood at the very center of a web of exchange that stretched far beyond the horizon. For the citizens themselves, the markets were also a meeting place, a hub of social life where alliances were formed, news was exchanged, and the spirit of community was reinforced through the simple acts of bargaining, sharing, and feasting. To walk through these crowded plazas was to experience Atlantis not as a mythic story etched in Plato, as dialogues, but as a living, breathing society, thriving on the rhythm of trade and the assurance that prosperity was not fleeting but deeply rooted in both the land and the sea. And yet even in this abundance there lingered the subtle reminder that prosperity once taken for granted can plant the seeds of ambition and pride. And pride, when unchecked, has a way of shaping the destiny of even the most powerful of cities. Beyond the crowded markets where citizens bartered and laughed beneath the watchful gaze of Poseidon's image, the scale of Atlantis' wealth could be seen most vividly in the ceaseless movement of its provinces and the constant rhythm of its harbors. For the city was not an isolated jewel, but the radiant heart of a vast dominion, whose outlying lands, rich with fields, forests, and mines, paid their tribute with unwavering regularity. From distant settlements came caravans of grain, herds of livestock, crates of timber, and baskets overflowing with fruits that only foreign soils could bear. and each offering was carried across land or water to be received in the capital as a reminder that Atlantis was both master and benefactor, provider and ruler, a city whose greatness was built not solely on its own soil, but on the combined strength of all the territories that acknowledged its power. These tributes did not vanish into the treasuries of kings alone, but flowed outward, into the lifeblood of the city, enriching festivals, strengthening armies and ensuring that artisans, farmers, and sailors alike shared in the prosperity that made Atlantis the envy of every neighboring people. The docks, meanwhile, presented a scene of unending vitality, where sails billowed in the wind and masts rose like a forest of wooden spires against the horizon. 4 ships of every size and design converged upon the island, their decks laden with goods, their crews eager to barter, trade, or rest upon the shores of a city whose name had become a beacon of fortune. Sailors from foreign lands mingled with Atlantean captains, exchanging not only cargo, but stories, maps, and knowledge. And it was here, at the edge of the sea, that the empire's prosperity revealed its most dynamic face. Warehouses by the docks overflowed with ivory tusks, golden ingots, amphorae of fragrant oil, and bolts of silk that glimmered like captured sunlight, while the air was alive with the sound of dockworkers shouting orders, the creak of ropes tightening, and the crash of waves against stone piers that had been built to endure both time and tide. What astonished many travelers most was not merely the scale of wealth, but the effortless way in which it seemed to circulate. For in Atlantis's abundance was not hoarded in secret chambers, but displayed openly woven into the fabric of daily life. Streets were paved, fountains sparkled in public squares, temples gleamed with polished metals, and festivals were marked by feasts where even the commoner could taste the richness of the empire's reach. This display was no accident, for the rulers of Atlantis understood that visible prosperity reinforced loyalty, and loyalty in turn fueled the cycle of tribute and trade that sustained their dominion. And so, within the bustling harbors and the endless flow of tribute, Atlantis appeared not only as a city of myth, but as a living empire, breathing with wealth, pulsing with commerce, and radiating the impression that its fortune could never diminish. Yet, as history so often reminds us, the very abundance that feeds greatness can also awaken desires that push beyond moderation. And in Atlantis, the glitter of prosperity would, over time, begin to blur the line between strength and arrogance, a line that no empire crosses without consequence. Amidst the grandeur of temples that gleamed in the sun and the docks that roared with the cries of sailors and merchants, there existed another side of Atlantis that was quieter, yet no less essential, a rhythm of daily life that unfolded within the courtyards and corridors of its homes, where generations lived not as isolated families, but as tightly woven households, bound together by memory, duty, and affection. A single dwelling might shelter grandparents, whose stories carried echoes of the island, as earliest days parents who labored in the fields or markets, and children whose laughter filled the spaces between walls of stone and timber, creating a tapestry of life that reflected both continuity and renewal. The homes themselves were not merely places of shelter, but small worlds of activity. Each courtyard an open-air heart where meals were shared, tasks were performed, and neighbors could be greeted over walls adorned with vines or drying herbs. Within these households, the sounds of labor blended with the rhythms of conversation, as looms clattered with the weaving of cloth that would become garments or trade goods, while tools rang against wood, bronze, or stone in the hands of craftsmen whose skills were passed down through generations. Women often oversaw the weaving, creating textiles dyed in colors that reflected the abundance of natural resources, while men tended to farming implements, repaired fishing nets, or worked at small crafts that added to the family's income. Children, curious and eager, learned by watching and imitating their earliest lessons, not written in scrolls, but carried in the gestures of their elders, so that every movement, whether the stroke of a loom or the swing of a hammer, became part of an unbroken chain linking past to future. Meals, too, were more than sustenance, they were rituals of belonging, prepared from grains stored in household granaries, vegetables pulled fresh from nearby plots, or fish carried home from the morning's catch. Gatherings often stretched into the cool of the evening, with food shared under the fading light, while elders recounted tales of gods, heroes, and the first Atlanteans, ensuring that memory itself became part of the family inheritance. In such moments, one could sense that the strength of Atlantis was not only measured in gold temples or harbors, but in the intimate bonds of households that nurtured loyalty, resilience, and the quiet stability that allowed the empire to thrive. The courtyards themselves were stages for countless small dramas. Children racing in play, elders offering advice with measured patience, neighbors calling out across narrow lanes to lend a hand or share news of the day. And though the city pulsed with grandeur on its grand avenues, it was in these humble spaces that the values of patience, respect, and balance took root, forming the unseen foundation upon which the greater structures of Atlantis depended. For a city is never built of stone alone, but of the daily lives of those who inhabit it. And in Atlantis, those lives wove together into a harmony that seemed destined to endure until, as fate would later remind the world, even the most harmonious chords can be disrupted by forces greater than any household could withstand. Beyond the quiet courtyards where families spun their thread, shaped their tools, and told stories beneath the evening sky, the soul of Atlantis revealed itself most vividly in its culture and devotion. For this was a people who believed that prosperity and power could not endure without reverence to the divine and the careful passing of knowledge from one generation to the next. At the heart of this cultural life stood the priests, men and women entrusted not only with the rituals that bound the city to its gods, but also with the preservation of hymns, chants, and sacred stories that carried the weight of centuries. Within the echoing halls of temples, whose walls shimmered with polished metals and stones of white, red, and black, the voices of choirs rose each dawn and dusk, their words weaving praise to Poseidon, the mighty guardian who had once claimed Plato and shaped the destiny of the island. The hymns were not merely prayers, but lessons in rhythm, balance, and humility, reminding each listener that their place in the world was part of a greater harmony that stretched from mortal life to the immortal realm. But the flow of knowledge was not confined to the sanctuaries alone, for on the docks and along the coasts, another kind of wisdom was handed down by sailors and navigators, who had learned to read the moods of the sea and the patterns of the stars. Fathers taught sons, and mentors instructed apprentices in the art of steering vessels across vast waters, teaching how to trust the rise and fall of waves, the shift of the wind, and the glittering constellations that guided them safely home. These lessons, often exchanged in the humblest of settings, a rocking deck, by a crackling fire, or in the hush of a night sea, were no less sacred than the rituals of the temples. For they, too, tied Atlantis to Poseidon, whose realm was the ocean itself. In this way, faith and practical knowledge were intertwined, each reinforcing the other, so that every sailor's journey became both a test of skill and a quiet act of devotion. Rituals to honor Poseidon were woven deeply into the fabric of Atlantean life. From great public ceremonies where offerings of bulls were led into sanctuaries adorned with gleaming orichalcum, to more intimate devotions, carried out by families pouring libations of wine or oil upon small household altars. These acts were not performed out of fear alone, but from a profound sense of gratitude, for the people of Atlantis knew that their harbors, their fertile fields, their strong walls, and their very survival were gifts of the sea god's favor. Festivals filled the city with color and song, as dancers traced patterns said to mirror the rolling of waves, while poets recited verses that recalled the union of Poseidon and Plato, reminding the people that their civilization was not merely human but born of divine intervention. Thus, culture and religion in Atlantis were not separate paths, but a single, intertwined current that touched every corner of life, from the sanctity of the temples to the rough-hewn wisdom of sailors, from the solemn hymns of priests to the joyous laughter of festivals where the god of the sea was celebrated as both protector and provider. It was this blending of reverence and knowledge of ritual and practice that gave Atlantis its identity, binding together palace and port field, and harbor citizen and priest, into a unity that seemed, at least for a time, unshakable, a unity that would later be tested in ways no hymn or ritual could have foreseen. While the voices of priests filled the sanctuaries, and the wisdom of sailors carried across the harbors, another force worked quietly, yet visibly within the lifeblood of Atlantis, a force that ensured the song's rituals and prosperity of the island could endure. Unbroken, even in times of trial, the discipline of its warriors. For though the Atlanteans lived in a society of abundance and reverence, they understood with unshakable clarity that wealth unguarded invites envy, that temples without defenders risk desecration, and that even a people who long for peace must keep their blades sharp and their shields ready if their way of life is to survive. Training grounds spread across the island echoed daily with the rhythmic thud of spears striking shields, the whistle of arrows slicing through the air, and the heavy cadence of disciplined feet marching in unison, for from youth to maturity, every Atlantean was taught that service in defense of their homeland was not merely a duty, but a sacred act that honored Poseidon himself. Their preparation was not born of aggression, but of vigilance, shaped by the wisdom that true peace is never passive, but requires guardianship. And so the citizens balanced their devotion to gods and families with the rigors of military drill. Warriors sparred in the shadow of temples, watched over by statues of their divine protector, and ships designed for commerce could swiftly be adapted for war, their sails trimmed and their hulls fitted with reinforced rams to meet any threat upon the waves. In the highlands, horsemen trained their steeds to respond to the faintest shift of a rider's weight, while in the coastal fortifications, sentinels learned to track the horizon with patient, unwavering eyes. Every district contributed to this martial readiness, so that the empire's strength did not rest solely upon a professional few, but was dispersed across the fabric of the people themselves, ensuring that Atlantis could rise as one in defense of its shores. What made their military truly formidable was not only their skill with weapons or their numbers, but the discipline that bound them together, a discipline forged in daily repetition and reinforced by the belief that they fought not for conquest alone, but for the preservation of a society that embodied harmony, prosperity, and divine favor. Yet for all their strength, the Atlanteans were not a people who glorified endless war. Rather, they sought to maintain a balance where the presence of their army discouraged threats before they could arise, where peace was sustained, not through submission, but through respect for a power that needed no exaggeration. Their soldiers were seen not as oppressors, but as guardians, men and women who stood as living walls around the fields, temples, and marketplaces, ready to act when called, yet content to return to their families when the day's training was done. To an outsider gazing upon their drills or walking past their barracks, it might have seemed that Atlantis possessed a restlessness, a city forever preparing for dangers that might never arrive yet. To the Atlanteans themselves, this vigilance was the price of stability, the guarantee that their children could grow, their temples could shine, and their harbors could thrive without fear of sudden ruin. In this way, the military strength of Atlantis was not a contradiction to its devotion or prosperity, but a natural extension of it, a living reminder that every hymn sung in the temples and every coin struck in the markets owed its endurance to those who bore the shield and spear. And as the empire reached the height of its glory, it seemed that this balance between faith, culture, and might would last forever, a harmony too perfect to be broken. Yet history, as we know, would later prove that even the strongest walls can be tested by the tides of fate. Yet as the discipline of warriors safeguarded the temples and the harbors swelled with tribute, a quieter transformation began to take root within the very halls of power. Subtle at first, almost imperceptible, like a slow tide rising against the shore, until it grew into a force that threatened the very foundations of the empire. For the same wealth that had once been a blessing, ensuring full granaries, vibrant markets, and radiant temples, began to weave its snares around the hearts of those who governed. The rulers of Atlantis, descended from divine lineage and entrusted with the sacred duty of preserving balance, slowly lost sight of the harmony their ancestors had revered. And with each passing generation, their gaze turned inward, not toward the well-being of their people or the favor of Poseidon, but toward the pleasures and indulgences their immense fortunes could provide. Banquets that had once been occasions of reverence where offerings were made to the gods, and gratitude was shared among nobles and citizens alike. Stretched longer into the nights, filled with laughter that was louder, wine that flowed more freely, and feasts that seemed less about honoring tradition and more about satisfying desire. Courtyards once reserved for solemn rituals became stages for parades of excess, where gold and orichalcum gleamed not as symbols of devotion but as glittering displays of status. Musicians played until dawn, dancers twirled beneath columns hung with silks imported from distant lands and platters heavy with meats, fruits, and delicacies were set out in such abundance that the act of feasting itself became a spectacle, a declaration that Atlantis had not only wealth, but wealth beyond measure. The leaders who had once walked among their people as examples of discipline and fairness now withdrew into palaces, where fountains sparkled, not for public use, but for private delight, where chambers overflowed with treasures collected less for their beauty than for the vanity of possessing them. In their indulgence, they forgot the patience that had guided the first generations, the balance that had once defined their society, and the humility that had tied them to the God who had shaped their island. Pride took root where reverence had once flourished, convincing them that their prosperity was not a gift to be preserved, but a right that could never be taken away. And so, little by little, the city that had once been known for harmony, discipline, and devotion began to show cracks in its foundation, not of stone or mortar, but of spirit. For when rulers lose sight of restraint, when feasts replace duty and pride overshadows gratitude, even the strongest walls and most skilled armies cannot shield a people from the consequences of their own excess. Atlantis, still radiant to the eyes of visitors, and still powerful in the reach of its empire, was already sowing the seeds of its decline. Hidden beneath the shimmer of jewels and the laughter of endless banquets, a warning whispered through history that no civilization, no matter how divine its origin, can remain unshaken when corruption takes root at its core. In time, the excesses of the ruling elite did not remain confined within their marble halls and perfumed gardens, for their influence spread outward like ripples across still water, shaping the character of the city itself, and eroding the moral fiber that had once distinguished Atlantis from lesser realms. The judges, who in earlier generations had been celebrated as paragons of wisdom, men and women chosen not only for their knowledge of law, but also for their patience, fairness, and devotion to truth, began to show signs of weariness and impatience, no longer weighing disputes with the calm deliberation that had once brought peace to households and stability to markets, but delivering judgments hastily, at times swayed by bribes or personal alliances, their role as guardians of justice slowly collapsing into little more than a performance of authority. The merchants once honored as the lifeblood of Atlantis for bringing treasures from distant shores and ensuring the prosperity of their people, grew ever more consumed by the hunger for profit, measuring their success not by the quality of their goods or the trust of their patrons, but by the weight of the coins clinking in their pouches. Markets that had once been places of balance and mutual benefit transformed into battlegrounds of deceit and rivalry, where haggling gave way to manipulation, and promises of honesty were easily abandoned in the pursuit of greater wealth. The fairness and generosity that had once been considered virtues among traders were replaced by an obsession with gain, until greed became the unspoken rule by which commerce was conducted. Even the rulers, whose ancestors had built Atlantis upon devotion to Poseidon and the customs that honored the divine order, no longer found joy in the rituals or reverence in the traditions that had once bound their people together. The festivals that had once carried profound meaning became empty pageants of spectacle, more concerned with display than with sacred devotion, while the temples, though still adorned with offerings, were no longer places of humble prayer, but stages for political gestures and performances of piety that fooled no one. The old customs, which had been a source of strength and unity, were slowly neglected, treated as relics of a bygone age rather than the pillars of a living society. Thus, beneath the shining walls and bustling harbors, Atlantis began to lose its very soul, the moral compass that had guided its people through centuries of prosperity slipping further from their grasp with each passing year. The city still gleamed in the eyes of strangers, still echoed with the sounds of trade and celebration, Yet beneath the surface lay an emptiness that no wealth could conceal, an imbalance that no army could defend against, and a decline that, though quiet and gradual, would prove far more dangerous than any storm at sea. Yet even as the moral fabric of Atlantis quietly frayed, the outward face of the empire projected an image of strength, ambition, and unshakable power. For the rulers who had once been content to govern their shining island began to look beyond their own shores, driven by a hunger for dominance that mirrored the growing appetites of their merchants and nobles. Storehouses that had once held the surplus of fertile fields and well-tended orchards now brimmed with goods, gathered not only from Atlantean soil, but from lands far beyond the horizon. As fleets of merchant ships returned from distant journeys laden with precious metals, spices, fine textiles, and exotic animals, all claimed as tribute from regions brought under Atlantean influence, these vast storehouses became symbols of might, as much as of wealth, reminders that the reach of Atlantis extended across waters where few dared to challenge its supremacy. To safeguard these expanding interests, armies were trained with a discipline that, though once rooted in defense of home and hearth, now turned increasingly toward conquest, as soldiers marched beneath banners that promised not only protection but dominion. The Atlantean military machine, fueled by the ingenuity of its engineers and the abundance of its resources, became an instrument of both fear and admiration, capable of establishing order in newly claimed territories, while also ensuring that no rival could easily rise against them. Their warhorses, clad in armor forged from the metals of their mines, and their weapons, gleaming in the sun, struck awe into neighboring peoples, who often chose allegiance over resistance when faced with such overwhelming power. Meanwhile, the harbors that had once bustled with fishermen and traders grew into vast naval stations, echoing with the clamor of sailors, the pounding of hammers on ship hulls, and the calls of captains readying their vessels for voyages that would stretch farther. With each passing generation, the fleets of Atlantis were not merely carriers of goods. They were floating fortresses, embodiments of the empire's ambition, ensuring that trade routes remained secure, that tribute flowed unbroken, and that the shadow of Atlantis stretched over seas and islands in every direction. These fleets became the very veins of the empire, carrying not only wealth, but also its will, binding distant regions into the web of influence that steadily transformed Atlantis from an island kingdom into a sprawling maritime dominion. In this way, the grandeur of Atlantis seemed to reach its zenith, for its storehouses overflowed with bounty, its armies marched with confidence, and its fleets ruled the waves with unmatched authority. And yet, even as its influence spread like a tide across the known world, the foundation upon which this empire was built grew ever more unstable, for the ambition that drove its expansion carried within it the seeds of its eventual undoing. But the march of empires has always been met with resistance, and Atlantis, in all its towering pride and outward magnificence, would soon encounter a challenge unlike any it had faced before, for across the seas to the east stood Athens, a city whose strength did not lie in glittering wealth or endless tribute, but in the determination of its people, the discipline of its armies, and the brilliance of its naval strategies. As the Atlantean fleets, massive and intimidating, spread their sails and advanced with the thunder of countless oars cutting through the waters, the Athenians prepared not with displays of extravagance, but with a quiet confidence, studying the enemy's movements, anticipating their maneuvers, and laying out defenses designed to exploit every weakness hidden beneath the overwhelming size of the invading force. When the clash finally came, it was not a battle of sheer numbers, but a contest of wit, endurance, and willpower for the Athenians skilled in the art of naval warfare, used the sea itself as their ally, drawing the larger Atlantean ships into tighter waters, where their bulk became a hindrance rather than a strength. Again and again, the smaller, more agile Athenian vessels darted in and out of formation, striking at vulnerable points and retreating before the Atlanteans could regroup, their discipline holding firm even as the odds seemed to tilt against them. It was a demonstration not of grandeur, but of resilience, for every maneuver revealed a city unwilling to bow before a power that believed itself destined to rule. The Atlanteans, who had grown accustomed to submission wherever their banners flew, now found themselves frustrated at every turn, their advantage of numbers eroded by the Athenians' careful coordination and deep knowledge of the seas they called home. Where they had expected an easy conquest, they met instead with cunning resistance, and where they had sought to overwhelm, they were instead outmaneuvered. As the battle wore on, the once invincible image of Atlantis began to show cracks, not in the strength of its ships or the sharpness of its weapons, but in the very spirit of its endeavor. For the Athenians revealed that empires built upon arrogance and excess could falter when confronted by a people bound together by discipline, unity, and an unyielding commitment to defend their freedom. In the end, the war with Athens became a turning point, not because the Atlanteans lacked power, but because their reliance on might and intimidation could not match the resourcefulness of those who fought with heart and strategy rather than indulgence and pride. And it was here, in the wake of this unexpected resistance, that the beginning of the end for Atlantis was quietly set into motion. Even as the clash with Athens left the empire shaken, a far greater threat began to stir from beneath the very foundations of Atlantis, one that no army could outmaneuver, and no fleet could resist. For the earth itself seemed to grow restless, grumbling with deep tremors that rattled the grand temples, shook the marble palaces, and sent unease through the bustling streets. At first, these strange quakes were dismissed as passing disturbances, the sort of natural rumblings that might unsettle the ground but soon fade away. Yet, as days turned to weeks, the tremors grew in frequency and intensity, until the once stable land upon which the Atlanteans had built their shining empire seemed to pulse with an ominous heartbeat of its own. The mighty walls of concentric stone that had so long stood as symbols of strength began to crack under the strain. Fissures spread through the streets like dark veins, and statues of gods toppled in courtyards where priests once sang hymns of praise. Farmers who had once tilled the fertile soil looked on in despair as the ground split beneath their fields, swallowing the crops that had nourished the city for generations, while sailors in the harbors watched in disbelief as the sea itself withdrew without warning, only to return moments later in surges of unnatural force that battered ships against their moors. Each tremor seemed less like chance and more like a warning, as though the very earth and sea were conspiring together to reclaim what had been taken, and to humble those who had long forgotten the balance their ancestors once cherished. Panic spread through the households of Atlantis, for the people who had grown used to abundance and prosperity suddenly felt the fragility of their existence, their voices echoing through the night as the ground roared beneath them and walls crumbled into dust. The grand banquets of the rulers turned into hurried councils of fear, as leaders who had once boasted of endless wealth now struggled to explain the signs of impending doom that no treasure could buy away, and no army could hold back. Even the priests, once so confident in their rituals, faltered in their chants, for their voices could not steady the trembling earth, nor could their offerings calm the sea that churned with restless fury. It was in these moments, when every stone tremor whispered of catastrophe and every gust of wind carried the weight of dread, that the people of Atlantis began to sense that their downfall would not come from the hand of a foreign enemy, but from the very forces of nature itself. A punishment written not in the strategies of men, but in the rumbling language of the earth and the unrelenting rhythm of the sea. What began as tremors in the earth soon swelled into a fury that no mortal hand could withstand, for the warnings that had rattled the ground and unsettled the seas gave way to a cataclysm that consumed Atlantis in a storm of fire, water, and ruin. The skies darkened with clouds heavy as stone, and lightning split the heavens as torrents of rain lashed the city, flooding the marketplaces where coins once gleamed, and drowning the courtyards where families had gathered for generations. From the mountains came rivers swollen with mud, and ash cascading into the plains with a force that shattered bridges and swept away fields. While beneath the streets, the earth groaned, as though straining under the weight of the city itself. Temples that had once risen proudly in honor of Poseidon and the gods now cracked and toppled in terrifying succession, their grand pillars tumbling into heaps of rubble, their sanctuaries reduced to dust, their sacred fires extinguished beneath waves of churning water. Statues of kings and heroes, carved from the finest marble, were wrenched from their pedestals and dragged into the depths, their faces vanishing beneath the surging floods that swallowed entire districts in moments. To the horror of the people, flames burst forth from fissures in the ground, as fire and water raged together in chaos, consuming what had once been the jewel of the known world. The docks, once alive with bustling fleets and the promise of trade, became a scene of desperation, as ships were hastily boarded by those seeking escape, their sails torn by violent winds before they could reach the safety of open waters. Families clung to one another on rooftops as waves surged higher, sweeping them into the sea, while survivors scrambled across broken streets in search of passage to the few vessels that had not yet been destroyed. Every corner of the island seemed to conspire against its people, earth splitting, water rising, fire devouring until there was no refuge left, only the terrifying certainty that Atlantis itself was being pulled into the abyss. And so it was that the once mighty empire, whose power had extended across oceans and whose wealth had dazzled even its enemies, collapsed beneath the weight of its own hubris and the wrath of the natural world, leaving only scattered survivors to flee into the unknown, carrying with them fragments of memory, whispers of glory, and the haunting tale of a paradise lost forever beneath the waves. And though the island itself slipped beneath the sea, erased from sight, as if the waves had swallowed not only its marble towers but every trace of its greatness, the memory of Atlantis did not vanish completely, for scattered among the currents of fate were those who survived, clinging to wreckage, carried by storms, or finding refuge upon distant shores. These wanderers, stripped of their homeland, yet burdened with its story, carried with them fragments of a civilization that had once believed itself immortal, and in their recollections half legend, half lament. The spark of Atlantis endured long after its stones lay buried beneath the ocean. Generations later, those echoes reached foreign lands. Their tales whispered around hearths, passed through markets, or woven into the songs of sailors who claimed descent from those who had escaped the cataclysm. Some carried artifacts, strange metals unlike any known, fragments of inscriptions etched in scripts forgotten, or relics that seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly craftsmanship that fueled the imaginations of those who encountered them, stirring questions of a people both magnificent and doomed. Among the places where these stories took root most strongly was Egypt, whose priests preserved ancient knowledge with meticulous care, inscribing events and myths into their records with a reverence for the past unmatched by most cultures of their time. It was here, within the temples of Egypt, that the story of Atlantis was said to have been guarded like a precious jewel. Whispered to the Athenian lawgiver Solon when he visited their lands centuries later. To him they recounted how a mighty island kingdom had once challenged the world only to fall, when its arrogance outweighed its virtue, and how its memory remained not as a warning etched in stone, but as a living lesson passed from one generation to the next. Solon, moved by the gravity of their tale, carried it back to Greece, where in time it would be told again by the philosopher Plato, woven into his dialogues not merely as history but as allegory, a narrative that bridged the line between myth and memory. Thus the legacy of Atlantis endured, not through ruins that might be seen with the eyes, but through words that traveled across centuries, reshaped, retold, and reimagined, until what began as the recollections of broken survivors became one of the most enduring mysteries of human civilization, forever hovering between truth and legend, between the possible and the impossible. Yet when the story at last found its way into the writings of Plato, it was given a new shape, one that was far more than the retelling of an ancient catastrophe preserved by priests and travelers. For in his hands Atlantis became not only a lost civilization of immense splendor, but also a mirror held up to humanity, a tale meant to provoke reflection as much as wonder. In his dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, Plato presented Atlantis as both a memory carried across generations and a parable of how greatness, when left unchecked by humility, can decay into corruption, and how the seeds of ruin are often sown not by the assaults of external enemies, but by the quiet erosion of character within. For the philosopher, the island was more than a geographical place. It was an idea, a stage upon which the struggle between virtue and vice, restraint and indulgence, discipline and excess played out in grand form. By framing Atlantis as a civilization that reached beyond the ordinary limits of wealth, knowledge and power only to collapse beneath its own arrogance, Plato invited his audience to ask whether the true cause of destruction lay in the clash with Athens or in the loss of balance. That came long before the first fleet ever set sail. Was Atlantis doomed by the clever strategies of its adversaries, or had it already been hollowed out from within, its leaders blinded by luxury, its merchants consumed by greed, its judges deaf to justice, and its priests unable to recall the sacred vows that once bound them to the gods? This duality, the blending of history and allegory, was at the heart of Plato's purpose, for he sought not merely to recount a tale of a city lost beneath the waves, but to use that tale as a vessel for larger truths about human societies, their cycles of rise and fall, and the choices that determine whether they endure or perish. In this sense, Atlantis became both a memory and a warning, a civilization both real and symbolic, an image of dazzling triumph and inevitable decline, designed to make those who listened pause and consider the fragile balance between ambition and morality, power and humility. Through this lens, the story of Atlantis ceased to be only a chronicle of survivors and disasters, and instead became a timeless reminder that the most dangerous enemies of any civilization are often the ones that rise within its own borders, hidden in the very successes that make it appear unshakable. And so, long after Plato's dialogues had been studied, debated, and passed from one generation of thinkers to the next, the story of Atlantis continued to linger like a shadow at the edge of memory, refusing to fade, for it was not only a tale of downfall, but also a tantalizing suggestion that perhaps, somewhere beneath the waves, fragments of that lost world might still exist. This possibility gained new life in the 19th century, when the ruins of Troy, once dismissed as pure myth, were uncovered through the determination of explorers who refused to accept that legend in history must always remain separate. What had for centuries been treated as nothing more than a poetic invention of Homer was revealed, stone by stone, to have been a city of flesh and blood, its walls and treasures proving that even the most unlikely stories could carry within them the weight of truth. The rediscovery of Troy ignited the imagination of scholars, adventurers, and dreamers alike, and it was inevitable that their thoughts would turn toward Atlantis, that other great mystery whispered from antiquity. If Troy could rise from the dust after millennia of doubt, then why not Atlantis from the depths of the sea? The very notion that a civilization of such grandeur might still be waiting to be found, its palaces preserved in silence, beneath waves, its artifacts sleeping in the dark of the ocean floor, inspired a renewed sense of hope that perhaps Plato's words were not merely allegory, but echoes of a forgotten reality. This hope reshaped the way explorers approached the tale, no longer dismissing it as fanciful philosophy, but instead treating it as a puzzle worth solving, a challenge set across time to those bold enough to seek. From the deserts of Egypt to the islands of the Mediterranean, from the coasts of Spain to the mysterious depths of the Atlantic, expeditions were launched, with the conviction that the next discovery might unveil what so many had doubted. Atlantis ceased to be a story confined to the pages of ancient texts, and became instead a quest that bridged scholarship, imagination, and the timeless human desire to uncover what has been hidden. In this way, the discovery of Troy did more than alter history. It rekindled belief that Atlantis itself might yet be real, that beneath the vastness of the world's oceans a forgotten empire might lie in silence, waiting for the day when its stones would once again meet the light of the sun. The fire of curiosity that Troy's rediscovery had sparked soon blazed into a fascination that swept across the 19th century, a time when explorers, scholars, and writers alike found themselves captivated by the notion that Atlantis might not simply be a parable of the past, but a real place whose ruins were waiting to be uncovered. In an age marked by dramatic discoveries, from ancient tombs unearthed in Egypt to forgotten temples revealed in the jungles of Asia, it seemed entirely possible that the ocean itself might conceal histories even grander than those already recovered on land. Thus Atlantis became more than a philosophical idea. It was transformed into a quest that spanned continents, oceans, and imaginations. Visionaries of the time began to connect the tale with stories of great floods preserved in cultures across the world, arguing that the sinking of Atlantis was not an isolated myth, but part of a collective memory of catastrophic events that reshaped humanity. The biblical flood, the Mesopotamian deluge of Gilgamesh, and countless indigenous traditions of lands swallowed by water were woven together into a tapestry that suggested Plato's tale was but one thread in a global narrative of civilizations lost to the sea. Writers proposed that Atlantis might lie beneath the Atlantic Ocean itself, a vast continent torn apart by earthquakes and waves, while others claimed it was linked to the ruins of cities submerged along the coasts of Europe, Africa, or the Mediterranean. The enthusiasm of the age was not confined to dusty libraries or philosophical debates, for explorers set sail with notebooks and instruments, their eyes scanning the horizon for signs of sunken lands, their imaginations fueled by the belief that beneath the waves lay evidence that would forever rewrite history. To them, every report of strange stone formations beneath the sea, every tale from sailors of lights flickering deep underwater, every rumor of ruins glimpsed through crystal waters became a potential clue pointing to the legendary kingdom. Popular books, widely circulated and eagerly read, filled the public with wonder, proposing bold theories that linked Atlantis not only to sunken cities, but to the origins of entire civilizations, suggesting that it had once been the cradle of knowledge spread to Egypt, the Americas, and beyond. By the close of the century, Atlantis had become not just a mystery of the ancient world, but a living question that captured the imagination of an era hungry for discovery, its name spoken in parlors and lecture halls with the same reverence as Troy or Babylon. A reminder that the boundary between legend and history might be far thinner than anyone had once believed. In the centuries that followed, the fascination with Atlantis did not fade, but instead evolved, taking on new life as modern archaeology began to unearth discoveries that seemed to breathe substance into the old legend and give fresh hope that the lost kingdom might still be waiting to reveal itself. One such moment of wonder came with the rediscovery of Helike in Greece, a thriving city that had once vanished beneath the waves after a sudden catastrophe in the 4th century BCE, preserved for millennia in layers of mud and sediment, before finally being brought back into the light by patient excavation. Too many Helike stood as a powerful reminder that Plato's tale of a great city swallowed by the sea was not beyond the realm of possibility. For here was proof that the earth and ocean could indeed erase an entire culture in a single night of disaster, leaving behind only whispers until the spades of archaeologists uncovered the truth. Across the Atlantic, another site stirred imaginations and fueled speculation when divers reported strange stone formations off the coast of the Bahamas, later called the Bimini Road. These enormous blocks, lying beneath shallow waters, appeared almost too precise to be natural, their straight edges and patterns giving rise to theories that they were the remnants of ancient harbors or roadways built by a forgotten civilization. Though scientists debated whether the stones were naturally formed or the work of human hands, the very existence of such mysterious structures in the depths of the ocean reinvigorated public fascination, convincing many that Plato's account was not simply allegory but encoded history waiting to be rediscovered. Other discoveries around the globe only added to this atmosphere of wonder. Submerged ruins off the coast of Japan, sunken cities in the Mediterranean, and enigmatic artifacts pulled from the sea all became pieces in a puzzle that seemed to hint at the survival of memories older than recorded history. While mainstream archaeologists often urged caution, emphasizing natural explanations and geological processes, the allure of Atlantis persisted, carried forward not only by professional researchers, but also by adventurers, writers, and ordinary people who longed to believe that the sea still concealed great secrets. Each new site, whether ultimately proven to be man-made or naturally shaped, added depth to the legend, reminding humanity that the earth is ever-changing, that oceans rise and fall, and that civilizations, no matter how strong, can be erased by forces beyond their control. In this way, modern archaeology did more than simply dig for artifacts. It rekindled the ancient question of whether Atlantis was once real, hidden somewhere beneath the waves, and kept alive the tantalizing possibility that one day a discovery might finally close the gap between myth and history. Yet even as these discoveries stirred wonder and gave rise to hope that Plato's tale might hold a kernel of truth, the steady voice of science offered a sobering counterpoint, reminding the world that fascination and possibility must always be tempered by evidence. Geologists, studying the structure of the ocean floor with modern tools, revealed that the Atlantic contained no hidden landmass vast enough to match the description of Atlantis, for the tectonic plates and seabeds had been mapped in detail, and nowhere did they allow for the sudden disappearance of a continent-sized realm within the timeframes suggested by the ancient story. Archaeologists, too, emphasized that no material traces, no inscriptions, no unmistakable artifacts, no ruins of temples or palaces had ever been found that could conclusively tie back to Atlantis itself, despite centuries of searching and countless claims of discovery. To these scholars, Atlantis was not a place lost to the sea, but rather a parable woven by Plato to warn of the dangers of pride, greed, and corruption, and while its imagery was rich and compelling, it remained allegory rather than history. Expeditions across the Mediterranean, surveys of the ocean floor, and deep dives in remote waters had yielded extraordinary fine shipwrecks, sunken harbors, forgotten cities, but none of them matched the scale or the details of the world he described. This scientific consensus did not diminish the importance of the legend, but instead reframed it, suggesting that its true value lay not in proving its physical existence, but in understanding the timeless lessons it sought to impart. Still, the absence of proof did little to silence the dreamers, for Atlantis had never belonged solely to the realm of science. It had always thrived in the space where imagination met possibility, where myth danced with memory, and where humanity, as longing to believe in lost worlds, continued to outshine the boundaries set by fact. And so, even as the scholars closed the door on the idea of a vanished continent beneath the Atlantic, the legend lived on, reshaped and retold, carried forward into new generations eager to search for what lay just beyond the reach of certainty. And even with the voices of science urging caution, the legend refused to fade, for Atlantis had already transcended the boundaries of geography and archaeology to become something far greater than a place that may or may not have existed. It had transformed into a mirror in which every generation could see its own triumphs and flaws reflected, a timeless reminder that civilizations rise with brilliance and ambition, only to risk collapse when excess and arrogance take root. Writers, philosophers, and storytellers across the centuries seized upon its imagery of concentric walls, gleaming metals, and sunlit harbors, weaving them into allegories of human pride and warnings against forgetting the fragile balance between progress and virtue. The idea of a mighty empire, undone not by external enemies, but by its own corruption, struck chords far beyond Plato's original dialogue, offering a lesson that felt as relevant to bustling modern cities as it had to the philosophers of ancient Greece. Artists painted its imagined ruins, poets mourned its downfall, and visionaries drew upon its cautionary message to question the durability of their own societies, wondering if they too might one day follow Atlantis into the depths of memory. Even popular culture embraced it, reshaping the tale for novels, plays, films, and games, each retelling layering new meaning onto the myth, while keeping its heart intact, the notion that no matter how high humanity may rise, the possibility of losing everything lingers just beyond the horizon. In this way, Atlantis endured not merely as a lost island, but as a powerful cultural symbol, one that carried within it both the glory of human achievement and the shadow of inevitable decline, teaching through story what history too often reveals too late: that greatness without humility is a fragile gift, and that the line between flourishing and ruin is far thinner than it first appears. From the moment Plato first recorded the tale of Atlantis, the story has lingered on the edges of human imagination, pulling us into a world that may have never existed yet feels as real as any city built of stone. We journey together through its mythic birth, where a god descended upon a sacred hill and found love that would give rise to an entire civilization. We walked across fields that blossomed with wheat and barley, breathed in the fragrance of olives and figs, and marveled at a society that prized balance between land and sea, harmony between people and nature. It was a vision of a world in which prosperity was not only possible, but seemed to flourish endlessly. Yet, as we moved deeper into the heart of this tale, Atlantis revealed itself as more than fields and houses, for its people mastered the forces of engineering, cutting canals and irrigating fields, creating water systems that provided both luxury and necessity. They've built with brilliance, using white, red, and black stone, shaping their city into a masterpiece of organization, where bridges spanned shimmering waters and harbors welcomed fleets from every horizon. The city glittered with metals both common and rare, including the mysterious orichalcum, whose gleam rivaled gold itself. Their marketplaces filled with voices and trade, their coins bore the image of Poseidon, and their prosperity seemed destined never to fade. In its golden years, Atlantis stood as a beacon of order and strength, where families shared homes filled with tools and looms, where priests sang hymns and sailors carried knowledge of the seas across generations, where soldiers trained for defense, yet maintained peace. The empire reached outward, sending ships to distant lands, storing treasures in vast warehouses, and building alliances and dominions that made its influence stretch far beyond its own shores. But in stories as in life, greatness rarely endures unchallenged. Slowly, corruption seeped into the heart of Atlantis. Leaders who once ruled with patience and balance began to drown in luxury, indulgence, and pride. Banquets grew longer, wealth was displayed with increasing arrogance, and the careful customs that once anchored society began to unravel. Judges no longer dispensed wisdom with fairness, merchants placed greed above honor, and rulers abandoned the traditions that had once safeguarded harmony. The empire, that had stood as a symbol of strength, turned its gaze outward in conquest and stumbled into war with Athens, only to be met with unexpected resistance. Strategy, discipline, and courage from the Athenians proved stronger than overwhelming numbers, showing that hubris often carries the seeds of defeat. And then, as though the earth itself had tired of their excess, the land trembled. Strange quakes split the ground, storms gathered, and the proud temples that had once housed the divine cracked and crumbled. Fires raged, waters rose, and the sea swallowed Atlantis in a single cataclysm, leaving only whispers and fragments carried by survivors. These fragments found their way to Egypt and through Solon to Plato, so that the tale endured not as ruins but as memory, reshaped through generations. Yet Plato did not merely tell the story to recount a lost city. He used it as allegory, asking whether destruction comes from without or from within, whether the downfall of civilizations lies not in foreign enemies, but in the corruption of their own hearts. His words invite us to reflect not only on the past, but also on ourselves. For the themes of Atlantis' pride, decay, resilience, and loss remain timeless. Through the centuries, people return to the myth with hope and wonder. The rediscovery of Troy gave rise to the dream that Atlantis, too, might one day be found beneath the sands or seas. Writers and explorers in the 19th century traced floods and ruins across the world, speculating about a lost continent beneath the waves. In modern times, sites like Helike in Greece or the Bimini Road in the Bahamas kept speculation alive, though science reminded us that no evidence has yet confirmed Atlantis. And geology makes clear that a continent cannot simply vanish from the Atlantic, and still, the story refuses to die. Atlantis lives not in stone or soil, but in culture, in imagination, and in the lessons we draw from its rise and fall. It reminds us that prosperity without humility is fragile, that power without wisdom is dangerous, and that even the mightiest societies are never beyond collapse. Whether Atlantis was a real city or a parable spun from Plato's mind, its legacy endures as both warning and inspiration. So perhaps the truth does not matter as much as the story itself, for in its echoes we find reflections of ourselves, our hopes, our fears, and the delicate balance that sustains human civilization. Atlantis may have sunk long ago, but in imagination it forever rises, a city both lost and eternal, guiding us with its caution and captivating us with its mystery. And now, as this journey draws to a close, may the waves of history settle gently in your mind, carrying you toward dreams as vast and mysterious as the ocean itself. Sleep well, and good night.